Good morning and welcome to the Matters of Substance podcast. My name is Caitlin Griffin, and today I am standing in for our normal host, Carly Samayoa. And with us today, we have our Executive Director, Dawn Pelk.
Hi. I'm glad to be back after all this time.
Good morning. Yes,
Good morning.
We're happy to be back. Your favorite duo is back, and we are recording an episode today. And with us, we have a special guest today. We have Meghan Buell, who is the founder and the board president of Transgender Resource Education and Enrichment Services, or called TREES, Inc. And this is a transgender educational nonprofit organization. She is a leader in the transgender community locally, regionally, and nationally. In addition to her work with her organization, Meghan guest lectures at colleges and presents at conferences around the country, and she is an out and proud transgender woman. So welcome, Meghan.
Thank you for having me.
Good to meet you. It's good to have you on our show. So today, I think we have a lot that we kind of want to cover, but we really we want for us and our listeners and the community to just be a little bit more educated and learn a little bit about communication and allyship, and the trans visibility effect. So if you want to just sort of give us a little background information, and we'll go from there.
Yes, and just for clarification, my pronouns are she and her, and I am a lifelong resident of northern Indiana. I grew up in Whiting, and over time I have migrated east along Lake Michigan, spent some time in Michigan City, LaPorte County, and now I live in South Bend. And so growing up in the region and in north central Indiana, being different comes a bit of a challenge to be out. I'm also, grew up at a time when there was no internet and there was no cable television. So resources and role models in the community were not existent. Today, there is so much information out there, and we want to make sure that people who need support and need those resources can get to them as quickly as possible. So after 25 years in corporate America and moving on into the nonprofit sector, working for a bit as the LGBTQ Resource Center Executive Director in South Bend, I decided that I wanted to give back to the transgender community, and I established my nonprofit, TREES, Inc., as a way to get through the clutter of what's out there for resources and vet great organizations and resources within those organizations and have those at the ready so that when people knock on our door or call us or email us, we can get them in contact with a good quality resource. I think back to when I was starting my discovery tour, personal discovery tour. We trusted what was out there because there weren't a lot of things, and we look, some people in my community look back on some of those and wonder how we made it. So we thought it was important to build good resources. And each of the letters in that acronym, TREES, are significant into our mission and our vision. That's the resource part. The education part is getting out there and working in the communities. And a lot of our work is focused in small town and rural communities because there are no resources there. And we don't want people forced all the time to go and find things or even have to leave their community. We want to build a trans inclusive culture wherever people are so that they can stay there, because otherwise they're leaving family, history, friends, potentially a job, and that's just unfair. And the last one is enrichment, and all of our work is really to end people's lives.
Yes, that's very good information. So can you tell us a little bit about, what exactly are people looking for when they've kind of give us what were you looking for, or where does some of the confusion happen when people are just they're discovering, they're sort of unsure of just everything? What happens when someone starts to question what they need to do or where they need to turn to?
For myself, when I started to question my gender identity, and gender identity is your internal sense of gender, and I knew it wasn't syncing up with the body I was born with and the gender I was assigned at birth. I felt I was the only one. I felt I was alone in this, on an island of one, and that scared me as much as anything else because I didn't even know where the first step. And there are a lot of people out there a lot of, especially youth, teens who start to question and wonder if they're the only one. And that can be overpowering and very scary to them. So we want to make sure that there's enough trans visibility and positive culture so that when a person has that aha moment of going, I think there's something amiss, they know where to go and find those resources. And so that our work is to get out into communities and have these conversations initially, and then fill that community up with resources and safe spaces and supportive organizations and services. The biggest question or inquiry we get all the time is medical resources, who to go to for a doctor and mental health professionals. But there's also questions that come from parents on how best to support at home. And so it's really across the board of just support, whether it's healthcare related, whether it's in schools, it's in the community, and within your family, is how do I support my family member, my friend, my coworker, and we try to help them, connect them with those. So it's really questions come from point of support.
That's good. So that's important to know too. So this is not just for people who are questioning their identity. This is for anyone and everyone who wants to show support and wants to learn.
In fact, we're doing community development on behalf of the transgender community.
Okay.
Our interactions with trans folks themselves, we usually point them in the direction of organizations and service providers who are doing that work directly. We're kind of the clearinghouse. That's why, I initially said, those resources and vetting good quality people. Our reputation is on the line when we send them somewhere. If I had developed an organization to do everything for all of them, I would need 1,000 full-time employees, and that's just not practical. So we decided we were going to take this little sliver and we were going to connect people to good things out there. There's no reason to reinvent what's going on and good stuff that's going on. So we just had to find those and have them point people in that direction. So yeah, we're working on communities and making them more trans inclusive so that when a trans person enters that community, they hopefully face less violence, hatred, and the potential for death.
I think that is great. I love that you stated that it's like a clearinghouse. So you're providing reputable resources for trans folks, and I think it's also important that you recognize that just taking like a sliver, as you said, and not trying to take on too much at once, because you want to be able to focus, give 100% of your effort to something versus only 20% of your efforts to 5 or 10 different things. So I really appreciate that. And I wanted to ask, so can you tell us a little bit of the difference between the LGBTQ Center and then, what is it that the LGBTQ Center does that is different from what Trees is doing?
As I mentioned, I was the director of the center, and I was at that time being pulled in so many different directions because there's a lot of different folks that I identify under that acronym. And I did see that I could only give 10 or 15% of what I really wanted to do for any of those demographics. And that was also part of why I wanted to develop Trees as an organization, is to take the trans and non-binary sliver of what they were doing and do at the center and give more focus to that and amplify the work for gender inclusion. The center itself is the place where they do the support work. They run support. They run the community events and are the first option within the community for support. What Trees does is helps them with trans and non-binary specific events, services, trainings, and things like that. And I've had a really good relationship with the current director. Talked with them prior to even opening our space to make sure they knew that it wasn't a competition, but an additional support within the community. And this is, having a gender resource center, brick and mortar, is a rare thing in the whole country. I think there are probably less than 10 that are not university-based in the whole country. And in the state of Indiana, there may only be 3 or 4 LGBTQ centers. So South Bend now has one of each, which really just ramps up, the possibility of trans inclusion. And every time a community becomes more inclusive, it improves the chance that we're going to save a life somewhere. And that's easy. That's an easy decision.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No question about that. And I think it is important to note that saving a life, to prevent or just preventing suicide or, like you said, violence is so important. But can you tell us maybe some of the obstacles that you faced, or I don't know if you want to call it pushback, but what have been some of the barriers, if any, when, developing this, working on this, people in the community? I know you were up here in Valparaiso, and you had a training, and, you weren't sure what, you might, be confronted with, but it ended up being kind of good. But if you could just tell us a little bit about, what you've experienced in people when it comes to just being open-minded, being willing to listen.
Most people don't think about this until a trans person enters their space. And especially so in workspaces, reactionary training is a lot less effective and efficient than proactive. And so we're hopeful that our engagements are before they've, had somebody or they made a mistake in the interaction. It really comes down to effective communications and building allyship. And my head is spinning. There's so many ways I could go with this. If you can't communicate effectively and respectfully, then that relationship is flawed from the start. So we do a lot of work with agencies and organizations that have frontline workers who are the first contact. And think about how you feel the first time you walk into a doctor's office or walk up to the counter at the pharmacy, or you walk into the school or your workplace, and they may look at you and misgender you, call you by the wrong pronoun, or they may look at you funny, or you just don't get a good vibe from them. You're hesitant to really become open with them and discuss things and want to be part of the team when you don't feel that you're being seen your authentic self. This is a barrier to people even wanting to learn new things. So the status quo is always the comfortable pathway through life. But the trans community is itching to be more visible, and they need places to feel themselves. They shouldn't have to take a deep breath, when they enter a space in the hopes that people aren't going to say something or judge them, or worse. And so the barrier to our work is getting people to understand that they need this more than they realize they need. And the things we teach are universal. Communication skills goes across. It's not just a trans related thing. Being an ally is not just a transgender related thing. So they learn concepts about communication skills and thinking before you speak and not making assumptions of gender based on appearance or voice, that are universal. And the feedback we get is a lot of that. I learned a lot of things that I took for granted, but I never really thought of. And now I understand how if I make an assumption and it's wrong, how that could really damage a potential relationship and hurt trust.
Okay, yeah, so that is helpful. So what are some assumptions that people should be aware of, or what people could look out for so that they aren't making assumptions? Maybe like a brief overview, because I know you said that there's like a week's worth of material we could cover.
Oh, yes. Our eyes and our ears mislead us a lot. Just about every phone conversation I have with somebody, I'm thought to be, a man. And so we have to stop before we act upon what we see or we hear. Earlier I mentioned gender identity. That's your internal sense of gender. And only a person can tell somebody else what their gender identity is. Gender identity is a human race characteristic. Everybody has it. Whether you identify somewhere in the non-binary or transgender community, or if you don't, and the term is cisgender, and that means your gender identity is in sync body. You have a gender identity, but not everybody is conflicted about it. Not everybody is working to resolve, emotional stress about it. It has nothing to do with your appearance. Your appearance is called your gender expression. So what you put on every morning, how you style your hair, whether you want to wear makeup or not, or paint your nails or not, boots, heels, tennis shoes, or flip-flops, those are all your gender expression. And that is just the way that you feel that day to go out and kick the world's butt. It doesn't tell a person your gender identity. Only you can tell them. But we jump to conclusions based on appearance of what somebody's gender identity might be. Thus, we think we're using the right pronoun based on that appearance, and we can be wrong. So the best way is, and you can do it in a very professional, respectful way, is you engage with somebody, especially for first time, just say, I want to show you the utmost of respect. May I ask which pronouns I should use when I address you? And that's how you find out, I find. So it's really, that's part of that communications, is understanding that what you see may not be what it is, and find out before you go the wrong direction. And you can default to a gender neutral type of language, like using they or their proper noun, but just ask, in a respect.
That's helpful too, to have that information.
Do you suggest that every time you meet someone, you should do that as like a rule of thumb? Like, you know what I mean? Like in everyday life, you're going to have conversation, or like you said, like maybe receptionist at the doctor's office or whatever. Would that be just something that you would do upon anybody's arrival when you're like greeting them?
Yeah, that should become standard operating procedure. You can even have it on forms. They could fill it out and put in their pronouns on there, and then you follow that lead. One of the easiest ways, since we do so much communication via video services, and putting your pronoun next to your name, pronouns next to your name. Then there's no assumption of that. Having it on your name tag, badges at work, in your email, signature line. But yeah, frontline people should be the first ones to say, may I get your pronouns so that I communicate with you respectfully. Some people will be put off by that, but that's for them to figure out. But when a trans and non-binary person comes in and you ask them that, they're going to feel welcome. And that's what our work is really about, creating those spaces where everyone feels welcome.
Yep.
So I guess sort of the opposite of that, if not necessarily an example, but what is a reaction for someone who is trans and they're not, if the first interaction they have with someone isn't really appropriate, or they feel that they were assumed, their gender was assumed. So what can be the result of that? I know you said it's a little bit flawed, the relationship, but what does that mean a little bit more in depth?
Well, when you're disrespected, you don't really want to be there. And, if it's someone serving a client, they may lose that client. That person may choose not to come back, if it's a restaurant or, something like that. So it's really, it hurts the bottom line for businesses and organizations when you don't show the respect. And the trans person shouldn't come in and be the educator of that space and to go, my pronoun is this, and I didn't. They should know up front. Too often trans people are put in the position of being the educators and the changer of culture within organizations, and that's an unfair burden to put on the trans person. But there's a lot of curiosity around trans community right now. There's a lot more visibility on social media and in TV and movies and everything else. Curiosity is fine, but there's a professional, level of interaction that prior to your curiosities, and that's a hard thing for humans to do, is to curb their curiosities, because we want to know. We always want, but in a professional setting is not the place to find those things.
Okay. Yes, that makes sense to me. I was able to put that together. So making sure that there isn't a burden on somebody to educate people. So if people want to become educated and they want to make sure that it's accurate information, what is a good resource for people? Say if it can't be your training specifically, if it's a little bit more general, but they want to educate themselves prior to coming in contact with or just having daily conversations. What can somebody do for that? Or is there a website or information they can use?
There isn't like a single website. Mm-hmm. That's why we exist, is to connect people, to the existing websites, depending on what they're looking to learn. Google transgender resources, and you'll usually find some decent stuff. And then you can check our website or our organizations, and if they're listed on our site, or we've shared them on our social media, then you can trust that they're good resources. And then each of those will have resource lists, and so it just layers and layers and layers. But it's become less about I just need to learn about Trans 101. People are looking for specific things, and good organizations are out there for that. Well, that's the biggest change from 20 years ago to now is, there isn't a one general Trans 101 out there. Now there are very specific within needs of the trans, a wonderful thing.
Yes, and that's what I wanted to make sure of, that it wasn't something that was very general, if people have specific questions, because there are many different identities, there are different parts to this that I wouldn't want people to think that they understood it all when they really only got a small piece of it. And because we don't know what other folks' questions are, what they're curious about, but just so that, they have something that's reputable. And like you said, reference leads to another reference to another reference, and it just kind of goes on from there. But just so that it's, a reputable source of information. So that is helpful.
It's a lot of people think it's cookie cutter, that one trans person is the same as the other. So there must only be one outline, one form, one way this goes. And the trans community is as unique as any other segment of the population. And our journeys are all our own and are unique, and the needs and the support will look differently. So if you come to one of my training, you will not know everything about the trans community. I don't know everything about the trans community, and I'm part of it. So that adds that level of that stigma, and why the culture change is needed, because so many folks are thinking one trans person is the same as the next trans person. So how I treat one person, it should work for somebody else, and it's not working. So we're diverse within our own diversity.
Yes, and that's important to note too. I believe that just like human beings, everyone has their own, outside of being just, say, female or a woman in her 30s. We're still different from, our neighbor, or we may live in the same neighborhood, we may work at the same job, but obviously each of us is different. So I see the value in that, and making sure that, it isn't just a one size fits all. It isn't a cookie cutter approach. And so does that sort of bring us a little bit into allyship and, at least effective communication? Would you say that that's a key part to allyship, or what is a key part to allyship?
Allyship really revolves around being there without asterisks or strings attached. You don't have support except for, times. It's either you're all or you're nothing. So, liking things on Facebook only goes so far as to show support. Inviting that person out with you into public spaces so they can get comfortable and work on socialization skills goes a lot further to helping enrich the life of that person you're being an ally to, more than the social media, where you can do it from the comfort of your own home and you don't have to go out in public and answer questions about things. So allyship is as much walking the walk rather than talking the talk. And it just is invaluable for a trans person to know that there are people who have their back in public space, because it can be really scary. And it keeps a lot of people at home thinking that their social media world is enough of the support for them to feel good about themselves. But if they can't leave their house and they can't go into public spaces without being deathly afraid, then their lives are not getting better. They're not getting. So we need to really stress that it's action. It's physical, being in a space, action. And allies. The other big aspect of allyship is the fact that if I, as a trans person, go and ask for trans rights, people are going to be like, well, yeah, because you're trans. But when a cisgender person goes and advocates for trans rights, that the power of their voice carries so much more, for change than the trans person or any demographic that's advocating for their own right. Use your voice to help lift other people's up to the same level as everyone else. So allyship is working on behalf of the trans community and using your non-trans voice to enrich trans life.
So what I hear is advocacy, being an advocate in a sense. And I think that is important because, like you said, it's people, if they're not comfortable, especially going into public places or socializing in a public setting, they can't, it's hard for them to just feel comfortable, like you said. And I think we all learned throughout the pandemic and having to be stuck at home and just only really being in contact via social media, the value and the importance of human connection and that how we need that as human beings. Everyone needs that. So now, even past kind of pandemic and people are now going back out, what about people, trans people who are still uncomfortable with going out, and they were uncomfortable with going out long before the pandemic? So it's like how that affects their mental health, I'm sure, is pretty huge.
Oh, yeah. And when I tell people about this, I talk about introversion and extroversion. And when we weren't allowed to be with other people, extroverts were harboring way too much energy they needed to release, and introverts were lacking getting that energy because it is just a transfer. And so trans people really were left to their own way of coping and getting through things, and it was really harder than people realize. You can't interact with other folks. So what we learn, the cisgender community learned from the pandemic of not having human contact. Think of the trans person who in a non-pandemic is sitting at home shaking because they don't have the courage or the confidence to walk out that door until an ally knocks on the door and says, "Hey, I'm going down to the coffee shop you want to go with." And then they have a support system. And that right there gets them out the door and gets them down. We can't expect the trans community to just pick themselves up and walk out the door on their own. Sometimes we have to go and hold their hand and walk them up. That's another key factor of allyship. Don't wait to be asked them.
Yeah, I have a question. Just generally speaking, if you are not like in the family or possibly like a coworker or know somebody that is transgender, how would you know, like just like if you're out in the community, how would you know that this person's transgender?
Well, hopefully you won't.
Right. I know that. Yeah. Okay. So I would not know that, and I would never question that. But
right. But don't approach your interactions as if somebody is trans or not. Approach them as if they're a human being, and treat all the human beings and interact with them all the same. We don't want people going around trying to figure out I think that person's trans and I think that person. No. Hey, I like what they're wearing. I like the way they did their hair. It should be that. You may find out that person's trans if you get to know them, but that that shouldn't be the motivation for looking around to try to who's trans and who's not trans. I am Meghan. Being trans is just one little segment of who I am as a person. So we don't have secret hand signals. We don't have lapel pin. If you look at my purse, I do. But we just want to be treated and interact with like every other person walking on the face.
Okay, I get that. But you referenced before that you should make, I guess, not so transgender people aren't isolated, to invite them out to coffee and all this. I mean, yes, do it as a person to person. I get that part, but well,
they would have to let you know. People in your network, you would have to know that they are.
Okay.
Not the random. I don't recommend knocking on random doors and going, "Hey, you want to go get coffee?
Yeah. Can I be your friend?" Okay, that clarifies. Thank you.
I think asking that question was important because what Meghan is saying is, so for people who I've never met before, or if someone comes to our coalition meeting and they're new, so instead of just assuming that they're a male or female, from moving forward, interactions, at least the way I'm looking at it, is with people I don't know already, making sure that we become introduced in a way that isn't assuming of their gender identity.
Right. Start the meeting off with, "Hi, my name is Meghan Buell. My pronouns are she and her, and we're going to call this meeting to order." So when you introduce yourself, always use your pronoun. And then somebody in the room that may be important to will go, "Ooh, so I can give my pronouns too with my name." And if everybody does that, then nobody stands out. Because the last thing you want to do is have somebody standing out as the only person that does the pronouns. What's up with them? No, if everybody does it, then it becomes everybody's, introduction.
And I've noticed that a lot more on email signatures, like Meghan had said before, especially like on a professional level, and especially in our field of like mental health, substance use, social workers. So I think it's come a long way that people are now.
Yes, especially I think, I don't necessarily think it's different like in a virtual setting, but I feel like, you can't always see someone, sometimes it's just not, I can't, the person that I saw online looks different than when I see them in person. So I feel like it's especially important in a virtual setting, just in case my camera quality isn't all that great on my personal computer. So, and just making sure that in a virtual setting where there can be some confusion of just, who you look like and, what your background is or what filter you've got on your Zoom thing, that you can identify yourself. And that's where I first noticed it taking place. And then I think it's moving into an in-person setting now.
Well, we were in fact pushing it in the in-person, and then everybody got put on Zoom. And it's funny when I do Zoom interactions and I get to the point about pronouns, and I talk about having it on your Zoom name, that I see them popping up like they're changing it while the training's going on. That's effective training when it's instantaneous, but they get it and they go, oh, I need to add that. Where it's disappointing is when I'm on a Zoom with advocates for trans inclusion and they don't have their pronouns by their names. And I'm like, you're missing a very simple step that shows inclusion. Are you interacting with other folks and trying to get them to support and advocate for trans inclusion, and you don't have your pronouns on your Zoom? So how do we expect other people to follow the lead? Again, it's not what I say, it's how I do. It's so simple that people just don't think to get people to think about it.
Yeah, and I think it is important to have that. And I also, just from my example, moving away from using the words addict, junkie, things like that, just all types of things. And just changing that because, like you said, the stigma around it, just making people feel just lousy about, part of their identity. Like you said, it's part of your identity. So I think that there is a shift in that. I've noticed people are, kind of staying away from calling it substance abuse or drug abuse, and it's a substance use disorder or mental health challenges, and not so much mental illness and crazy and psycho type of things. Because it can be damaging, and
It makes somebody feel like they're not enough.
Right. What about, this is a serious question, but when people refer to older adults as the elderly or those old crows, or I've heard that before. It's offensive.
Absolutely. This is the think before you speak. If your words are not lifting people up, should you even say that?
I think you're right, Megan, what you just said. Think before you speak, and along with the older generation of people, it is harder for them, I think, to start changing language, and not impossible, but I'm just saying it's more of a challenge because you've gone this long period of time and without any changes, and you're just like going along, and now all of a sudden the stuff that seems new, which isn't really new, but to a lot of the older sect, seems like it's harder to get on board with this, and so they're not offending anyone. What do they like? What do you do? Because I'm thinking they're not in the workforce, so how would they, bring this into their language and their,
Practice. You have to practice. And they're not incapable of learning.
True.
They're reluctant to learn. And they use I've been calling you this for 35 years. That's just an excuse to not want to change. It's not really in being incapable of changing. So it takes practice. I have this conversation with parents of trans and non-binary youth all the time about how do they get to use the pronoun and new name if there's a new name quickly. Because what's happening is they're waiting until their child's in front of them, and then they're speaking and they're defaulting to what they had been doing for a long time. What they need to do is they need to practice so that the new name and the new pronoun come to the forefront and are instantaneous rather than having to think about it. The suggestion that I give to parents of trans and non-binary youth is to write the new pronoun and name on Post-it notes and stick it around the house. Put it on the mirror in the bathroom or steering wheel, put it on walls, wherever you go. Every time you see that, you will internally say it. And the more that you say it, the more that your muscle memory changes. And then when your child's in front of you, it's going to come to the forefront faster than trying to think before you speak on that. So it takes practice. And I've gotten so much positive feedback from parents who go, I didn't think that would work, but it really works. And it is. It's just training. It's training your brain to, when you see something, to react in a certain. We do it with so many.
Yes, like in our mental health first aid training that we do, there's a segment talking about and asking about suicide, and having people practice and actually saying it out loud. Are you thinking of suicide? Because a lot of people are afraid to ask that question, to use that word, and or they're just not used to saying it, or they're saying, well, you're not thinking about hurting yourself, right? Or you're not thinking of doing stupid to hurt yourself, right? And that's not appropriate. You're not really getting to, you're kind of skirting around. So I do think practicing, training your brain, having little reminders. I know that when you write something down, handwrite something down, that you're more likely to do it and have reminders and stuff like that. So I think that's a good example of how people can, like you said, train their brain.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Megan. I was thinking more along the lines of like maybe some listeners that we have that are maybe 70 years old. They don't have any, they're not a parent of a child that's transgender or anything like that. How do they, like acclimate themselves into this language or whatever? Like, how would they even know? That's what I guess I was getting at. Not people that knew anything about transgender. What if there's people listening right now that they're not sure? And you did a good job, of explaining and giving the basics and everything. But how, do you have suggestions, as a starting point for them?
Sure. The first thing I would recommend is, in order to learn something new, sometimes you have to unlearn what you already know. So perhaps they could practice on people they do know, but go back to the step of I don't know you and introduce themselves with their pronouns and ask them, respectfully what the other person's pronoun is. Or until that point, just use they or the proper name, and just redo these introductions with people you already know and let them know why you're doing this so you can get used to it. And then the more you practice with people around you, then you'll be ready to interact with somebody you've never met before. So utilize people around you. Run through the exercise. You can do it over, between bingo games, and just practice with the people around you and say, I'm going to reintroduce myself to you. Nothing's going to change, but we're going to work on the communication part of it, introduction part.
Very helpful. So we are actually getting kind of close to time, but I don't want to totally cut it off right here. But I do want to make sure that if there's anything else, any other questions we might have for Meghan, or if Meghan, you want to share anything more that you want listeners to hear, for sure that we cover that before we, get ready to close in a few minutes.
How long do we have?
About 3 minutes.
3 minutes?
3 to 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, what do you think, Meghan?
I, again, just am thankful to be able to have this conversation. This is part of the trans visibility, is even without your eyes, you can hear about inclusion, and a trans person sitting here kind of giving you, my perspective of things. I think it's important to always keep your mind open and let people tell you about themselves before you make a judgment about who they are or might be, because you're probably going to.
Helpful.
No, it is helpful. Thank you for coming and explaining all of this to us. And I hope our listeners learned something and could move forward with their thought process.
Yes, hopefully our listeners have taken something away from this. They feel more comfortable. They feel more comfortable, I suppose, looking further into, research and visiting. Meghan, can you just remind the listeners your website if they want to visit the website?
Yes, it's www.webetrees, and that's WEBETREES.org. Or if you just Google Trees Inc. Transgender, we come up to the top of the page.
Perfect, yes. Hopefully our listeners are able to find what they're looking for and be able to get their questions answered by looking at the website, the resources, and by also listening to this episode. But again, Meghan, we are thankful that you were able to join us today. I know this was very educational and eye-opening for me personally. So I know that other people, our listeners, will find it educational for them as well.
Thank you again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Meghan.